Hi, I'm Rachel, and I'm here to review 3 books off of the BookTube Prizes 2019 Octafinals list for groups F and G. That's a little wordsy. But anyway, what I mean is that at the beginning of the year, when there were 48 books on the Octafinals list, I cherry-picked 12 that I had read or wanted to read, and siphoned them off into groups of 3 to read, review, and put into my own personal shortlist, and now I'm to my final 3, which happen to be from groups F and G. Anyway, the BookTube prize was started by Robert at Barter Hordes. We're currently in the semifinals rounds. I'm participating unofficially, but there are a whole lot of judges that have whittled the list down to these 12 books that officially remain. And the BookTube prize hashtag should take you to any and all videos about people talking about the prize. And anyway, I thought I'd review these 3 books in reverse order, meaning I'll start with the one I read last, which is also the one that didn't make it out of the Octafinals, and that is The Ensemble by Asia Gabel. This book follows a group of 4 friends and professional colleagues, really, who band together to create a chamber music quartet with the hopes of going public, making it professional. We open with them at their graduation recital and their first official contest out of the country. It's 1992. They're all in their 20s and just kind of desperate to get out there. And that concert doesn't actually go all that well, but then in the next part, Gabel keeps jumping ahead in time for the course of 20 years, and they're able to get a teaching position where they're able to also play together on the side at Juilliard. And basically we go on from there as they try to create a career for themselves and are ultimately pretty successful in that regard. The 4 characters are Henry, who is a prodigy and in fact is sort of the wild card of the group that could tear them apart, because people would be courting him to have a soloist career because he's sort of head and shoulders above the rest of the group. And then there's Jana, the one who is driven to make a chamber group together and sort of wants to define herself as having a successful professional life, sort of in contrast to her mother, who wanted to be an actress and never really made it that far. Then there's Daniel from a religious family who basically doesn't understand his musical proclivities, and he comes from little money and is mostly scrounging around at the beginning and has a bit of a chip on his shoulder about that and sort of commitment phobic. And then there's Britt, who of course they end up together because she's kind of the opposite. She lost her family to unfortunate, early deaths, as it were, and she's basically looking for new connections and sort of a romantic, so they have an on and off again relationship. I think Gabel succeeds at describing the music, everything from the physicality of it, like how to play it and the emotions it evokes, to the physicality of playing any chamber music for that long amount of time and sort of the exhaustion that it brings to the body, and the impairments even of all of those repetitive motions with, your violins and violas and cellos over and over and over again. I think she's less successful with the emotional lives of the characters. Her voice is too passive. She tells us too much about them than show us. I think the backstories with their families in particular never really made it off the ground, but the music that bound these people together and their shared goal is ultimately the selling point of the novel. I liked the commentary, the ruminations that came naturally from the idea of harmonizing together as a group and what that says about, harmonizing in your relationships and listening to people and listening to yourself. And I do think by the end of the book, I was invested enough in the characters that I was glad to see where they ended up 20 years down the road. I don't think it's the cream of the crop, but I do think it was worth some recognition, and I'm glad I got to read it. Next, or second in the month, I read The Book of M by Peng Shepherd, which made it to the quarterfinals round. This is a fantasy novel, really, or a magical realist novel with the conceit of, in our normal contemporary world, one day people start losing their shadows, and along with that they start losing their memories. We're specifically following a handful of characters, although this really affects the entire world. it's about the world ending, basically, because people get violent and confused when they lose their shadows, and infrastructure basically goes down, and people also forget to, eat and take care of themselves, so just in general, population numbers seem to be down as well. A lot of the action of the book takes place on the east coast of the US, and for the most part it's empty, barren wasteland, with some cities being hotspots for violence. The first and probably main characters we follow are a couple, Max and Ori, who live in DC. They're at a wedding in Virginia when the pandemic strikes America in huge force, and they basically camp out there for several months until Max, the wife, loses her shadow. And then when Ori is out scavenging for food, she decides to leave. Basically because she doesn't want to waste away in front of him. She wants to see if she can find a way to cure herself and then get back to him, because there are rumors about a certain sort of prophetic man who is doing something to try to bring memories back. And he is, of course, another POV of the book. He is a man who actually, before all of this went down, was in a horrible car accident and had a strange, unusual case of amnesia where he forgot pretty much everything about himself before, and is never really able to regain those memories, but he keeps making new ones. And he's brought in to talk with the first man who loses his shadow, who lives in India. And that sort of brings in some of the only world building that Shepard does in terms of giving her magical forgettingness some sense of structure. We get some interesting Hindu mythology, which plays into what this prophetic figure later does to try to bring memories back. Another character we're following is Naz. She's a girl from Iran, but she comes to America because she's a great archer, and so the US, I guess, is poaching her for the Olympics before everything goes down, of course. She's actually in one of the first cities in the US to be struck. And she basically struggles to make her way to DC, where she runs into Ori and a bunch of other characters before they ultimately head further south to where the prophetic man is located. As I was reading the book, I was invested in the action. I was curious about where it would go. But at the end of the reading experience, I felt relatively underwhelmed. It seemed like a lot of the action that the characters go through along the way are there for shock value rather than anything else. Or maybe not shock value, but Shepard's putting them in there because it sounds, quirky to her, She doesn't really have any real rules for this magic system that she's created, and as a science fiction and fantasy fan, that kind of irks me, because it feels like what literary fiction writers might think of science fiction and fantasy, that it doesn't have to make sense. And it does. It's not just there for the plot to be random and unpredictable. And that just irked me more and more, even though I kind of like where we ended the book. And I like, as we traversed through the countryside, we saw various ways of shadowless and shadowed reacting to this, huge apocalypse, basically, and that people have very different ideas about what it means and how they're going to respond to it. So yeah, I think in terms of a message, I think it had interesting but relatively shallow things to say about the power of memory and connection to people. But in terms of an all-encompassing post-apocalyptic novel, it doesn't really hit the mark. And finally, or technically first of all these books, I read Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid Rojas Contreras, which is still currently in the official running for the BookTube prize. This book takes place in Colombia during the reign, as it were, of Pablo Escobar and drug activities and paramilitaries and guerrilla groups. Colombia was thrown into a fair bit of terror based off of bombings and later kidnappings of rich people in the hopes of financing violent campaigns. We have two narrators of this story. The first and primary one is Chula. She's a young girl growing up in a gated community in Bogota. And we start following her when she's about 7, and her mother hires a new girl to help around the house. This new girl, she's about 13, her name is Petrona. She lives in the slums. She has a very different lifestyle than Chula does. Her house is made of shoddy, discarded materials. Members of her family, particularly the men, started getting killed off or joining guerrilla groups and later getting killed off, even her younger 12-year-old brother. But most of the story is told from Chula's point of view, where she's aware, first from the periphery and then getting closer and closer to her, of all of the violence happening in her country. But for the most part, she and her family on their own are relatively safe. But Chula is aware of strange things surrounding Petrona, who she kind of idolizes. There's a man who hangs around and even comes to their house uninvited when no one else is home. And Chula keeps Petrona's secrets because she likes her. One of my favorite parts of the book, I think, is the disparity between Chula's POV and Petrona's POV. There's an immediacy and emotional tension to Petrona's more fleeting, shorter POVs, but also I like the fact, just the reminder of how little Chula plays into Petrona's real life. Anyway, there is an ultimate dangerous plot twist which makes Chula and her sister and her mother come as refugees to the US. As the book goes on from here, I think the weakest part is introduced, namely that years are passing now, and I don't think Chula sounds any different as a teenager than she did when she was 7 to 10 years old. I don't necessarily think she should sound as innocent. I think we should see more in her perception of the world how she's changed. Anyway, I feel like I'm trying to sidestep around spoilers, but ultimately this is a book about women caught in the crossfire of all of this violence. I think Rojas Contreras has a really strong voice for both of her characters. They certainly sound very different from one another. We get a very full sense of what life is like in both socioeconomic communities. I can see why this has staying power, so in that vein I think I'm going to agree with the official BookTube prize, and I will personally hold this up as the book that I will be advancing to my own shortlist. So that about covers it for me now. You can find links to the other 3 videos I made where I reviewed the rest of the books I cherry-picked. This is the end of my review content for the 2019 BookTube prize. Maybe next time I come back to this it'll be in an official capacity. I will also be back in October to talk about my shortlist and my personal winner, as well as how the official BookTube prize panned out. In the meantime, I have a whole lot of other reading projects I want to get to, and I hope they'll be as fun to film as the BookTube prize has been. So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.